The first time I signed my father's name for him, my hand shook like I was forging a stranger. The hospice folder was open on the kitchen table, pages clipped in tidy stacks. Everything labeled in fonts that tried to make the worst things sound manageable. Care plan, comfort kit, emergency contacts. I stared at the line where Frank Hollis was supposed to write. Frank Hollis. And I felt the same old reflex rise up in me. The one that said, tighten up. Be serious. Be useful. Don't make anything weird. My dad sat in his recliner by the window, a blanket over his knees. Even though the house was warm, the light from the late afternoon made the room look softer than it was, like if you squinted, you could pretend this wasn't happening. His cheeks had gone a little hollow since the diagnosis. He'd always been sturdy, a man made of wrists and forearms in habit. Now his hands looked thinner on the armrests, veins more visible. "Rob," he said like it cost him something. "You reading the whole dictionary over there?" I forced a laugh that came out wrong. "Just making sure I don't accidentally agree to anything that gets you sent to space." He watched me for a second, eyes steady. He used to look at me like that when I was 17 and lying badly. Not angry, not dramatic, just present. "Sign it," he said. "You're the one doing the legwork." My pen hovered. My own name was already printed in 3 different places because I'd filled out the forms in a rush the week I took leave. Caregiver leave. It sounded clinical, like something other people did, people who had it together. I signed his name for him, slow and careful. And when I finished, I realized I'd been holding my breath. That was how it began, really. Not with the diagnosis call, not with the drive to his place with a trunk full of practical supplies, not even with my manager's strained sympathy when I told him I needed time off. It began with ink and paper and the quiet shock of becoming the adult in the room while my father was still sitting right there. I moved into his house 2 days later. It was a small place on a quiet street, the kind of neighborhood where lawns were trimmed out of habit and people waved from porches like they were paid for it. Dad's house smelled like coffee that had sat too long and the lemon cleaner he used when he had energy. It was clean but lived in. Tools lined the garage wall in careful rows. The fridge was mostly condiments and stubbornness. I brought groceries, a pill organizer, extra bed sheets, and the kind of bland crackers nurses always recommend. I brought my laptop for paperwork and a stack of mail that had been piling up at my apartment. I did not bring the one suitcase I stared at for 10 minutes before I left. That suitcase sat in my closet at home, heavy with the small life I'd built in secret corners. A soft blouse that fit my shoulders just right. A cardigan I loved because it made me look gentle. A pair of flats that made my steps quieter. A cheap wig that was never perfect, but was enough to let my face relax when I put it on. Little things that made me feel like I could breathe through my skin, not just inside my lungs. I told myself it didn't matter. This wasn't about me. This was about Dad. So I left it. I stopped dressing the day I took leave, like flipping off a light switch. No debate, no ceremony. I folded the soft parts of myself away and replaced them with jeans, plain t-shirts, and the hoodie I used to wear for yard work. I shaved every morning like I was suiting up for a job I couldn't quit. I made lists. I learned the schedule for meds. I memorized the sound of his breathing when he slept because the nurse said that mattered. The numbness came quietly, like fog sliding in under a door. At first, it felt like relief. Less to manage, less risk, no chance of being caught in something that could cause a scene. If you make yourself into a tool, tools don't get complicated, but the days were long and repetitive in a way I wasn't used to. In my regular life, I had a commute and coworkers and tasks that ended. Here, there was no ending. There was only the next pill time, the next glass of water, the next meal. Dad pushed around with a fork. There was the sound of the oxygen machine humming in the corner like a bored appliance, and the way the house got too quiet at night. I started moving through the rooms like a ghost, doing the motions. Laundry, dishes, phone calls, insurance, hospice visits. I watched my father sleep, and I felt nothing, which made me feel worse because what kind of son feels nothing while his dad is dying? Leah came the first Monday, stepping into the house like she already knew it. She was a hospice nurse with calm eyes and shoes that looked like they'd seen a lot. She carried a bag that held half a pharmacy and a notebook that looked like it held the other half. Hi, Rob, she said, like she'd been expecting me specifically. I'm Leah. Is Frank up for a check-in? Dad waved a weak hand. I'm right here, aren't I? Leah smiled at him, not in a pity way, just in a human way. You are? How's the pain today? Annoying, he said, like a neighbor who doesn't know when to go home. She laughed softly. That's a pretty accurate description. While she checked his vitals, she asked questions that sounded casual but weren't. How much he was eating, how much he was sleeping, whether he'd felt nauseous, whether he was anxious. She asked me questions, too, like I was part of the patient file. How are you holding up? She asked while Dad stared out the window, pretending not to listen. I'm fine, I said automatically. Leah didn't challenge it. She just looked at me a moment longer than most people do when they're deciding whether to believe you. Okay, she said like she'd file it away for later. If anything changes, call. After she left, Dad said, She seems sharp. She is, I said, and went back to folding the towels the exact same way he used to, like that could keep something from tipping over. The second week, my cousin Marcy started showing up more. Marcy was the kind of person who filled a room just by being in it. She was loud in a way that sometimes meant funny and sometimes meant bulldozer. She brought casseroles in foil pans and opinions in bigger containers. I told my boss I'd be in and out, she said the first time, setting a bag of takeout on the counter. I'm not leaving you to do this alone. That's nice, I said and meant it, even if my chest tightened a little. Marcy cared. Marcy also watched people like she was trying to read a label. She walked into the living room and kissed Dad's forehead. Careful. Uncle Frank, how you doing? Dad opened one eye. Still handsome, still charming. Marcy snorted. That's not what I asked. Dad's smile faded into something tired. Still here. Marcy's face softened for a second, then she went brisk again. Okay, we'll make it work. She started cleaning without asking, rearranging things so they made sense to her. She moved the pill organizer closer to the sink. She labeled the drawers in the kitchen like the house was a classroom. She asked me questions like I was an employee. Did he take his morning meds? Yes. Did you call the insurance about the new equipment? Not yet. I was going to after lunch. Lunch, right? And did he eat breakfast? He ate some toast. Some toast. She repeated like that was a crime. My patience, already thin, got thinner. One night after Dad had fallen asleep early, I sat at the kitchen table with the hospice booklet open and my laptop showing a bank account I didn't fully understand. Dad's finances were simple, but not simple enough. I was tracing payments and bills and wondering how many things I'd forgotten when I realized Marcy was standing in the doorway watching me. You're doing a lot, she said, surprisingly quiet. I shrugged. It's what it is. Marcy leaned against the frame. You look different. My stomach clenched. Different how? She waved a hand, searching. Like you're not all the way here. Like you're wearing a mask. I almost laughed because if she knew what mask actually meant, she'd choke on the word. I'm tired, I said. It's fine. Marcy's gaze flicked to my hands, to my face, like she was inventorying me. Just saying. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. When she left, I stayed at the table long after the screen went dark. My reflection in the window looked like a man I knew, but didn't particularly like. Square jaw, short hair, tired eyes, the kind of face that disappears into crowds. My shoulders were broad from genetics and a decade of pretending I liked being strong. I looked like I was built for this kind of role. The beautiful son, the guy who handles it. Inside, I felt like a locked drawer. A few days later, Dad called me into the living room in the middle of the afternoon. He was sitting up straighter than usual, like he'd been waiting. The sunlight was bright, making the dust in the air visible. The TV was off. That alone made me wary. What's up? I asked, trying to sound normal. He patted the arm of the couch. Sit. I sat, keeping my hands in my lap. I'd learned to hold my body smaller around him lately, like I didn't want to take up space he might need. Dad looked at my face for a long time. Not casually, not like he was checking whether I'd shaved, like he was looking for something. What? I said, too sharp. He blinked slowly. You look like you're wearing someone else's face. The words landed so cleanly, I couldn't pretend I didn't hear them. My throat tightened. I'm fine, I said again, because that was my script. Dad sighed, and it rattled in his chest. Rob, I'm not in the mood for scripts. I stared at the carpet. It's just I'm trying to do this right. You're doing it, he said. That's not the question. I swallowed. My heart felt like it was beating against a wall. Dad's voice stayed calm. You used to come over sometimes and you'd be lighter. You'd joke. You'd tell me about some movie or some song. You'd look like you wanted to be here. I want to be here, I said quickly. He raised an eyebrow. Even weak, it was still the same eyebrow that had called me out for decades. Then, why do you look like you're bracing for a hit? I didn't answer. The house hummed around us. The oxygen machine, the fridge, the distant sound of a lawnmower somewhere on the street. Life happening like nothing was changing. Dad shifted his weight and winced, then settled again. I've been thinking, he said carefully, about a lot of things. About what I did right, what I did wrong, about what I never asked you. My mouth went dry. What are you talking about? He looked at his hands, then back at me. You've always been private. You always took your feelings and put them in a box. That's partly my fault. I wasn't exactly a poet. I wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, because that's what sons do. But the truth stuck in my teeth. The truth was heavier. Dad said, I don't have the energy for guessing games anymore. So, I'm going to ask you straight. Are you hiding something from me? My pulse hammered. The rational part of me screamed. Not now. Not here. Not with him like this. Keep it simple. Keep it clean. Keep it about him. But I looked at my dad's face and saw how thin the skin had gotten around his eyes. I saw how his body had started giving up in small, humiliating ways. I saw how time was shrinking. The numbness cracked. I heard myself say, yes. Dad didn't flinch. He just nodded once like he'd expected it. I stared at my hands. It's not what you think. How do I know what I think? He said, almost amused. You haven't told me anything yet. I let out a breath that sounded like defeat. I dress sometimes. Not like for a joke. Not like Halloween. I mean, I put on women's clothes. I do my hair. Sometimes makeup. I have a name I use sometimes. Not legally, just for me. Silence filled the space between us. I waited for the explosion that never came. I waited for anger, for disappointment, for the sharp edge of rejection. Dad just sat there absorbing it. His eyes stayed on my face, steady. You stopped, he said finally. It wasn't a question. That made it worse somehow. I swallowed hard. When you got sick, I thought I needed to be serious. I thought it would be disrespectful or, I don't know, like I needed to be the kind of son people expect. Dad's mouth tightened. And what kind is that? I shrugged helplessly. The kind that doesn't complicate things. Dad shook his head slowly, then winced. Rob, everything is complicated right now. That's the point. My eyes burned. I blinked fast, angry at myself. I hadn't cried yet. Not really. Not in front of him. Not in front of anyone. Dad's voice softened. When your mother left, I didn't know how to talk about feelings. I knew how to pay bills. I knew how to keep the lights on. I thought that was enough. I stared at him stunned. He almost never talked about Mom. Not like that. He continued. You learned from me. You learned to swallow things to be fine. I laughed once, sharp and broken. Yeah, I got real good at it. Dad's gaze didn't move. You don't look good at it now. My chest ached. I don't know what you want me to do with this, I said, voice low. I can't be a mess and take care of you. Dad looked away toward the window, then back. I don't want you to be a mess. I want you to be you, whoever that is. Before I go. My throat tightened so hard it felt like swallowing glass. Dad. He lifted a hand, shaky. Don't let me say it. I shut up. My hands clenched in my lap. Dad said, I don't have a lot of time left for pretending. I don't want my last months to be you, shrinking yourself into a shape you think I can tolerate. I'd rather meet the real you. The room tilted a little. It was too much, too direct, too kind in a way I didn't know how to handle. I'm scared. I admit it, barely audible. Dad nodded like that was reasonable. So am I. I looked at him, and the tears finally spilled. Quiet, humiliating, unstoppable. Dad didn't reach for me. He wasn't strong enough. And also, he wasn't the kind of man who used to do that, but he watched me cry with the same steady attention he'd given me as a kid when I scraped my knee and pretended it didn't hurt. When I got up to wipe my face in the kitchen, I heard him call out, "Rob." I paused in the doorway. He said, "What's the name?" My heart stuttered. "What?" "You said you have a name you use sometimes," he said. "What is it?" I stared at him like he'd asked me to hand him my ribs. "It's Rose," I said, voice shaking. "Sometimes, not always, but yeah." Dad repeated it slowly. "Rose." Then he nodded once like it mattered. The first time I dressed in that house, it wasn't some dramatic reveal. It was a Tuesday night. Dad had fallen asleep after Leah's visit. Marcy had gone home, leaving behind a stack of washed dishes and a list of things she thought I should do tomorrow. The house was quiet except for the hum and Dad's breathing. I stood in the hallway outside the spare room that had become mine and stared at my duffel bag because I had gone back to my apartment the day after Dad asked that question. I told myself it was for more clothes, more supplies. That was true. It was also not the whole truth. I had stood in my closet and looked at the suitcase I'd left behind. I'd touched the fabric of the blouse with fingers that felt numb, then not numb. I'd packed it. I'd packed a simple skirt, not flashy, just soft and knee-length. I'd packed the cardigan. I'd packed the wig, still in its cheap net, and my small makeup bag. Now it was here in Dad's house, like contraband. I changed slowly, listening for any sound from the living room. My hands shook as I pulled the blouse over my head, as if the fabric itself could set off alarms. The mirror in the spare room was small and slightly warped, probably bought decades ago and never replaced. My reflection looked half familiar, half strange. I put on the skirt and smoothed it down with my palms, breathing in a way that felt new. My legs looked pale. My knees looked like mine. My body was still my body, broad shoulders and all. But the clothes shifted the outline, softened the message. I put on the cardigan and immediately felt my chest loosen, like a knot had been tugged open. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and just existed. No performance, no big moment, just a quiet exhale. I didn't do makeup that first night. I didn't put on the wig. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I was trying not to vanish. I walked out into the hallway barefoot and crept toward the living room like a kid sneaking snacks. The light was dim. Dad's recliner was a dark shape by the window. He was awake. My stomach dropped so hard I almost turned around. Dad's head tilted slightly. "Rob." I froze. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I didn't think you were up." He blinked a few times, eyes adjusting. Then his gaze settled on me. I waited for the look, the judgment, the shock, anything. Instead, his mouth curved, small and tired, but unmistakably warm. "Well," he said softly, "there you are." I couldn't speak. My eyes burned again. Dad patted the arm of the recliner weakly, like he was gesturing to the room. "Come sit. Don't hover like you're about to bolt." I moved slowly into the living room and sat on the couch. The fabric felt different against my bare legs. My hands were clenched together, so tight my knuckles hurt. Dad looked at me with that steady focus again, but this time it felt less like interrogation and more like attention, like he was memorizing me. "You look calmer," he said. I let out a shaky breath. "I feel less like I'm wearing armor." Dad nodded. "Armor's heavy." We sat in silence for a while. Not awkward, not forced, just quiet, like the house itself was listening. Then Dad said, "Rose." I flinched slightly, just hearing it out loud. He said it again, gentler. "Rose?" I swallowed. "Yeah." He stared out the window for a moment. "Your mother wanted to name you that, you know." My head snapped toward him. "What?" He smiled faintly. "She did. If you'd been born a girl, she liked Rose." I told her it sounded like an old lady name. She told me I had the imagination of a shovel. A laugh escaped me, startled and real, and it sounded strange in my own ears. Dad's eyes crinkled. "She would have liked you," he said, then paused, correcting himself. "She would have liked this part of you, too. I think." The words hit me hard. I didn't know how to hold them. I didn't know where to put that kind of tenderness. I whispered, "Why didn't you tell me that?" Dad's gaze dropped. "Because I didn't know how to tell you a lot of things." The next day, Marcy showed up early as usual. I had already changed back into jeans and a t-shirt. The old reflex was still strong, but something in me had shifted, like a door that had been cracked open couldn't fully close again. Marcy walked in with a paper bag of pastries in a bright voice. "Morning, boys. I brought sugar because we're living in a tragedy and at least we can eat something decent." Dad was awake, sitting in his recliner with a cup of tea, looking like he'd been waiting for her. Marcy kissed his cheek. "How's my favorite uncle?" Dad's eyes flicked to me, then back to her. "I'm doing all right." Marcy took in the room, then looked at me. "You sleep some?" I said. She set the pastries down and started fussing with the mail pile. "Leah coming today," I said. Marcy frowned. "Should be more often." "It's what hospice schedules," I said, trying to keep my tone even. Marcy tossed a piece of junk mail into the trash. "Hospice schedules like we're ordering takeout." Dad cleared his throat. "Marcy." She turned. "What?" Dad's voice was quiet but firm. "Don't bulldoze him." Marcy blinked, caught off guard. "I'm not bulldozing. I'm helping." Dad's eyes didn't move. "Helping isn't the same as controlling." Marcy's cheeks flushed. She glanced at me. "You didn't tell him I was being controlling, did you?" I held up my hands. "I didn't say anything." Dad said, "I'm saying it." Marcy's mouth opened, then closed. She huffed and grabbed a pastry. "Fine, whatever. I'm just trying to keep things from falling apart." Dad's gaze softened slightly. "Things are falling apart," he said. "That's what dying is." Marcy went still. The word hung in the air, blunt and unpretty. Dad wasn't dramatic, but he was honest. Marcy swallowed hard. Then, like she couldn't stand the quiet, she said, "Okay, so what needs doing today?" I watched her, and I felt something I didn't usually feel with Marcy. Sympathy. Her loudness was armor, too. That afternoon, after Marcy left, Dad asked me, "Are you going to tell her?" My stomach tightened. "Tell her what?" He gave me a look. "Don't play dumb. I'm dying, not stupid." I rubbed my hands on my jeans. "I don't know. She'll make it a thing." Dad shrugged as much as he could. "She makes everything a thing." I exhaled, half laugh, half sigh. "Yeah." Dad watched me for a moment. "You don't owe her a performance, but you also don't owe her a lie." It sounded simple when he said it. It was not simple when I tried to live it. The next time I dressed, I added a little makeup, just enough to soften the shadows under my eyes. I put on the wig, brushed it until it looked less like plastic and more like hair. I chose a simple dress, not tight, not flashy, navy blue with a small pattern, something that could pass as normal in a grocery store if my nerves didn't give me away. When I walked into the living room, Dad looked up and smiled the same small smile as before. "You're getting bolder," he said. "I'm trying not to panic," I admitted. Dad nodded. "That's a good goal." We spent that evening watching an old crime show Dad liked, the kind where the detective always solved it in 40 minutes, and everyone wrapped up their grief neatly. Dad dozed off halfway through. I sat on the couch in my dress, listening to his breathing, and felt the grief press against me like weather. It didn't leave. It didn't soften. It just shared space with something else. Now, with relief, with breath. When Marcy finally walked in on it, it was not on my terms. She arrived earlier than expected on a Friday, key in the lock like she owned the place. I was in the kitchen making soup, wearing the cardigan and skirt again, hair down, no wig this time, just my own hair grown a little longer than usual and brushed forward. I had lipstick on, faint, because it made me feel less gray. The door opened. Marcy's voice rang out. "I got the paperwork you wanted, and I swear if this insurance company makes us fax something in 2025, I'm going to start a fire." I froze with a ladle in my hand. Marcy stepped into the kitchen mid-rant, then stopped like she'd hit an invisible wall. Her eyes widened. They flicked over me fast. Cardigan, skirt, lipstick, the shape of my posture that wasn't pretending to be bigger than it was. For a second, she looked like she couldn't breathe. Then she said loud and sharp, "Are you kidding me?" My stomach dropped. Marcy. She stepped closer, voice rising. This is what you're doing now while your dad is dying. I set the ladle down carefully. My hands were shaking. It's not what you think. What I think, she snapped, is that you're making it about you. The words hit exactly where I was already bruised. Dad's voice came from the living room, tired but clear. Marcy. She whirled toward him. Uncle Frank, do you see this? Dad's chair creaked as he shifted. I do. Marcy looked at him like she expected him to join her outrage. And you're okay with it? Dad's gaze stayed steady. Yes. Marcy's mouth fell open slightly.
How?
How are you okay with it? Dad's voice was soft but firm. Because he's still my son. Because he's taking care of me. Because he's a person, not a machine. Marcy's eyes flashed. He could do all that without this. I felt my cheeks burn. My throat tightened. Dad said, could he? Marcy stared at him, thrown off balance. Dad continued. I asked him to stop hiding in my house. That's what I asked.
I don't have a lot of time left.
I'd rather spend it with a real Rob than with a numb robot who thinks he has to wear a uniform to be worthy. Marcy's jaw clenched. She looked back at me and her face twisted between anger and fear. You didn't tell me, she said. I swallowed. It wasn't about you. Marcy flinched like I'd slapped her. No, I guess not, she said bitterly. Everything's just secret. Leah's voice came from the doorway then, surprising all of us. I can come back later, she said gently. Marcy spun toward her. Oh, great. Perfect timing. You should hear this. Leah stepped inside calmly, eyes taking in the room, the tension, the way my shoulders were hunched like I expected impact. She didn't react to my clothes, not even a flicker. She set her bag down like it was any other day. She looked at Marcy. What's going on? Marcy threw her hands up. What's going on is my cousin is dressed like this, and I'm supposed to just what? Clap. Leah's expression stayed calm.
He's dressed.
He's also here. He's also caring for your uncle. Both can be true. Marcy's voice went louder. But this isn't the time. Leah nodded slowly, like she'd heard that sentence in 100 different flavors. There's never a perfect time for people to be themselves. There's always stress, grief, obligations. But caregivers are still people. If he has something that helps him stay grounded, that matters. Marcy stared at Leah like she'd betrayed her. Leah turned her gaze to me. How are you feeling right now? I swallowed hard, like I want to disappear. Leah nodded once, understanding. That makes sense. Marcy scoffed. So now we're making space for his feelings while Uncle Frank is the one dying. Dad's voice came again, tired but sharp. Marcy, enough. Marcy's eyes filled suddenly, and that surprised me more than her anger. I'm scared, she blurted like she hadn't meant to say it. I'm scared and everything's changing, and I can't handle more surprises. Leah's face softened. That's honest, she said. And it's okay to be scared, but fear doesn't give you the right to hurt people. Marcy wiped her eyes aggressively. I'm not trying to hurt him. I'm trying to keep the focus where it belongs. Leah said, the focus belongs on your uncle's comfort. Part of that comfort is knowing his son is okay. That matters to people. At the end, Marcy looked toward Dad, and something in her expression shifted. She saw him, really saw him, smaller in his chair, eyes tired but still sharp. Dad said quietly, I want him to breathe in this house. Marcy's shoulders slumped, her anger drained into exhaustion. She looked at me again, and her voice got quieter, rougher. Is this who you are all the time? I shook my head because the truth was messy. Not all the time, but it's part of me. It's the part that keeps me from going numb. Marcy swallowed. I don't get it. I know, I said. She looked away. I don't know what to do with it. Leah said gently. You don't have to get it today. You can start with not attacking him. Marcy let out a shaky breath. Fine, she muttered, then softer, almost to herself. I'm sorry I yelled. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't warm, but it was something. That night, after Leah left and Marcy went home, Dad called me back into the living room. He looked tired, more tired than usual, like the argument had cost him. Guilt stabbed me. "I'm sorry," I said quickly. "I didn't mean to." Dad lifted a hand. "Stop apologizing for existing." I swallowed. Dad's gaze was steady. "You think being serious means being stiff? You think being a good son means disappearing? I don't want that." My eyes burned again. "I don't know how to do both," I admitted. "How to be me and also be the guy who handles things." Dad's mouth twitched. "Maybe you are both." The days after that were quieter. Marcy still came by, but she didn't comment on my clothes. The first time I wore the cardigan around her again, she looked at me for a second, then looked away like she was choosing not to poke the bruise. That was in its own way care. Sometimes she'd ask awkward questions, half defensive. "So, you like dresses?" I'd answer simply. Sometimes she'd grunt. "Okay." And we'd move on to meds and groceries, and whether the insurance company had finally approved the new mattress. Dad's health kept sliding, slow and relentless. There were good days where he ate half a sandwich and joked with Leah about the terrible hospital coffee. There were bad days where he barely opened his eyes, and the pain made him grimace even with the medication. Leah taught me how to change the sheets without moving him too much. She taught me how to watch for signs of discomfort. She taught me that doing your best doesn't always look like fixing things. Sometimes it looks like sitting in the mess and keeping someone company. One afternoon, while Leah checked Dad's pulse, she asked me quietly, "Are you taking breaks?" I almost laughed. "What's a break?" Leah's eyes didn't leave mine. 5 minutes outside, a shower without rushing, a meal you actually taste. Those count. I nodded, even though I wasn't sure I believed her. Later that evening, I stood in the bathroom with my hands on the sink, staring at my reflection. My face looked older than it had a month ago. The stubble I usually shaved was back, because I'd forgotten this morning. My eyes were red-rimmed. I looked like someone who could disappear completely, and no one would notice until the chores stopped getting done. I went back to the spare room and changed. This time I chose the navy dress again, the one that felt like quiet. I brushed my hair slowly. I put on a little makeup not to look pretty, just to look awake. I stood in front of the mirror and said softly, "Rose," like I was practicing a language my mouth had forgotten. Then I walked into the living room where Dad was awake, staring at the ceiling like he was counting something invisible. He turned his head slightly when he heard me, his eyes focused with effort. When he saw me, his face softened. "Hey," he whispered. "Hey," I said, and sat on the couch beside him. We didn't watch TV. We didn't fill the space with noise. We just sat there with the house humming around us. After a while, Dad said, "You know what? I regret." My throat tightened. "What?" He swallowed slowly. "All the times I thought love meant be tough. All the times I thought feelings were a luxury." I stared at him, heart aching. "You did your best." Dad's mouth twitched. "Yeah, but my best had blind spots." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just stayed there, my hand resting on the couch cushion near his, not touching but close. Dad's voice got quieter. "I'm glad you told me," he said. I swallowed hard. "Me too." He blinked slowly, eyes heavy. "Promise me something." "Anything," I said too fast. Dad's gaze held mine. "Don't put yourself back in the box when I'm gone." The words hit me like a plea, not a demand, like he was trying to reach beyond his own ending. I nodded, tears spilling again. "I'll try." Dad's eyes softened. "Trying is enough." He slept after that, breathing slow and uneven. I stayed on the couch, still in my dress, listening to the night sounds. My grief was there, solid as furniture. It didn't shrink because I had lipstick on. It didn't vanish because my legs were bare under a skirt. But something else stayed too. Something lighter. The sense that I wasn't disappearing completely. The sense that I could be here fully, without apologizing. In the early hours of the morning, I heard Dad's breathing change. A slight hitch like a wave pulling back. I stood up slowly and walked to his chair. I knelt beside him, careful not to jostle him. His face looked peaceful and far away at the same time. "Dad," I whispered. His eyes opened halfway. He looked at me unfocused for a second, then saw me. A faint smile tugged at his mouth. "Rose," he breathed, barely audible. My throat closed. "Yeah," I whispered. "I'm here." He blinked slowly. His fingers twitched against the blanket like he was trying to move, trying to reach. I slipped my hand over his gentle. His skin felt thin and warm. He held on just a little. Then he exhaled long and soft, and the room went very still. I didn't scream. I didn't collapse. I just stayed there, forehead resting near his hand, and let the reality settle like dust. When Leah arrived later, her face told me she already knew. Nurses have a way of reading silence. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. Marcy came an hour after that, eyes swollen before she even walked in. She saw me in the dress and cardigan and stopped, grief flickering into surprise for a second, then back to grief.
She didn't comment.
She didn't argue. She just stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me, clumsy and tight. "I'm sorry," she whispered into my shoulder. "I'm sorry I made it harder." I held her shaking. "I know." We stood like that in the living room where Dad had spent his last months, where the oxygen machine was now silent, where the sunlight still came in through the window like it didn't care what had changed. Later, after the calls were made and the paperwork started, after the house filled with the strange quiet that comes after someone leaves for good, I went into the spare room and sat on the edge of the bed. My hands trembled. My chest ached. The grief was sharp, like a fresh bruise you can't stop touching. But I was still dressed. I was still here. I thought about Dad's voice, tired but firm, saying he'd rather meet the real me before he went. I thought about the way he'd said Rose like it mattered. I thought about how the numbness had been a kind of hiding, too, and how it had almost swallowed me whole. Outside, the neighborhood went on. A car door closed. Someone laughed in a yard. Life kept moving, careless and relentless. I stood up and walked back into the living room, into the space Dad had occupied. I smoothed the cardigan sleeves down my arms, a small grounding motion. I looked at the empty chair and let the tears come again. Grief stayed, but hiding left. Did you like the story? Hit that like button and tell me what you thought in the comments. Do you want to hear more stories? Subscribe and hit the bell. For exclusive content and early access, check out our Patreon. You can find the link in the description, or you can watch any of the videos shown on my right.